He walked into the Hargrove Motors showroom with a child's drawing tucked into his shirt pocket and a toolbox that had seen better days sitting at his feet. The drawing was of a car. Specifically, it was of a very orange car with lopsided wheels and a driver who appeared to have no neck. His daughter had made it the previous Tuesday, pressed it into his hand before school, and said, in the particular way 7-year-olds have of stating things as absolute fact. "That's the car you're going to fix, Dad. I already drew it." He had folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He always did. His name was Darnell Osei. He was 38 years old. He owned a garage called Osei & Son on the edge of Pemberton, Ontario. A town small enough that most people still waved at strangers, large enough to have 2 Tim Hortons and one opinion about each. The garage had belonged to his father-in-law, then to his wife, and then, after the accident 3 years ago on the QEW in January, to Darnell alone. He had kept the name. He thought about changing it sometimes, late at night when his daughter was asleep, and the garage smelled like cold steel and the particular quiet of a small town after 10. He never did. He was not supposed to be at Hargrove Motors that morning. He had a fuel line to replace on a 2009 Civic. He had a brake job booked for Thursday. He had a daughter, Mina, who had asked him twice that week when they were getting a dog, and who was currently under the impression that he was going to give the matter serious consideration. What he did not have was any business being in a showroom that looked like an airport terminal, all glass and poured concrete and lighting, designed to make expensive things look like they were glowing from within. The cars here did not have price stickers. If you had to ask, the woman at the front desk would smile and suggest a complimentary espresso while she found someone who could help you. He had not come for espresso. He had come because of a phone call he had received the previous evening from a man named Clifton Hargrove, who was the 3rd generation of Hargroves to run Hargrove Motors, and who, by most accounts, had turned a regional dealership into something that appeared frequently in automotive trade magazines and occasionally in the lifestyle section of the Globe and Mail. Clifton Hargrove had a collection of restored vehicles that was considered, among people who cared about such things, to be one of the finest private collections in the country. He also had, at that particular moment, one car that would not start. "Mr. Osei," Hargrove had said on the phone, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man unaccustomed to the sensation of needing something he could not simply purchase. "I was given your name by Bernard Lacroix." Darnell knew Bernard. Bernard was 71, ran a machine shop in Barrie, and had hands that had spent 60 years inside engines. If Bernard had given someone his name, there was a reason. "The car," Hargrove said, "is a 1963 ISO Grifo A3L, one of 11 remaining in the world. It belongs to a client of mine, a woman named Vivienne Ashworth. She's bringing it here for the Pemberton Concours next weekend. The engine turned over at a pre-transport inspection 6 days ago. It has not started since. My service department has had it for 4 days." There was a pause. "They cannot identify the problem," Hargrove said. "I need someone who can." Darnell was quiet for a moment. Outside his kitchen window, the maple in the backyard was doing what maples did in late September, which was turn a color that made you feel vaguely apologetic for all the time you spent indoors. "I can come tomorrow," he said. "My team will be there. You can consult." "I work alone," Darnell said. Not unkindly, just clearly. Another pause. Hargrove was, Darnell suspected, a man who did not hear that sentence often. 8 o'clock, Hargrove said. 7:30, Darnell said. "I have to drop my daughter at school at 8:15. Mina had insisted on coming. This was not technically permitted. Darnell had explained this twice, once at dinner and once at 6:45 in the morning while she was putting on her shoes with the focused intensity of someone who has already decided the matter is settled. "I'll be quiet," she said. "You're never quiet." "I'll be mostly quiet." He looked at her. She was wearing her orange rain boots, which she wore regardless of forecast, and a sweater that said Canada in letters that were already beginning to crack along the edges. Her hair was in 2 braids that he had done himself, which meant they were technically braids in the way that a child's drawing is technically a portrait. The intention was there. The execution was approximate. "You stay near me," he said. "You don't touch anything, I know. If anyone asks, I'm your assistant," she said, with the solemnity of a person taking an oath. She picked up the small red toolbox they had given her the previous Christmas. A real one, child-sized, with real tools that were not dangerous and one wrench that was, technically, dangerous, but small. I have my kit. He almost said something then. He swallowed it instead, the way fathers learn to swallow things, and put on his coat. Hargrove's lead technician was a man named Stefan Bauer, who had trained in Stuttgart and had the bearing of someone who had spent many years being the most qualified person in every room he entered. He greeted Darnell in the service bay, with a handshake that was technically polite and a look that was not. "The timing chain has been checked," Bauer said. He held a clipboard. "Fuel delivery confirmed. Ignition system tested. The compression readings are..." He paused, noticed Mina, paused again. "Is this?" "My daughter," Darnell said. "She's quiet." Mina was, in that precise moment, examining a torque wrench on a nearby bench with the focused attention of a museum visitor encountering a particularly interesting artifact. She did not look up. Bauer looked at the torque wrench. He looked at Mina. He looked at Darnell. "The compression readings are within spec," he continued. The car was in the back of the service bay, separated slightly from the others, as though even the other vehicles understood they were in the presence of something that required a certain respectful distance. It was small and low and dark blue, which was a color that in certain lights looked almost black and in certain other lights looked like deep water. The hood was up. The engine, a Chevrolet 327 V8, which was not what most people expected to find under the hood of an Italian sports car, and which was, in Darnell's opinion, one of the more interesting footnotes in automotive history, sat exposed in the morning light. He stood in front of it for a long time without touching anything. Bauer, behind him, shifted his weight. One of the other technicians found something suddenly urgent to do on the far side of the bay. Mina crouched down and looked at the undercarriage with the absolute seriousness of a person who has been told not to touch and is therefore committing every visible detail to memory instead. "When it cranked," Darnell said. "What did it sound like?" "Like it was going to start," Bauer said. "And then it didn't." Darnell nodded slowly. He pulled on his gloves. "Can you have someone bring me the original service records?" he said. "Not the recent ones. The ones from the last restoration. Those are with Mrs. Ashworth's people. They're in Toronto." "Call them," Darnell said. Bauer opened his mouth, then closed it. He took out his phone. By noon, 3 things had happened. The first was that the service records had arrived by email. 62 pages of handwritten and typed documentation from a restoration completed in 1991 by a shop in Hamilton that no longer existed. Darnell read every page. Mina sat on an upturned milk crate beside him and ate the sandwich he had packed for her, her legs swinging. Every few minutes she would ask him something. "What does that word mean? Why is that part shaped like that? How come it says 327 if it's Italian?" And he would answer each question without looking up from the page, which was how they had always worked, how they had always been. The second thing that happened was that Stefan Bauer stopped hovering. It was not something he announced. It was more that, around 11:30, he had apparently decided that whatever Darnell was doing, it did not benefit from an audience, and had relocated himself to a glass-walled office where he could watch without appearing to watch. Darnell noticed and said nothing. The third thing that happened was that Mina found the fuel line. She had not been looking for it, exactly. She had been looking at the engine the way she looked at things she found interesting, which was with a cocked head and the particular expression she got when she was building a theory. She had asked Darnell if she could look at the thing that went around, by which she meant the distributor cap, and he had said yes, just look, don't touch, and she had leaned in very carefully and then said, in the flat informational tone she used for stating facts, "Dad, this thing looks different than the one in the book." The book was a repair manual for the 327 engine that Darnell kept in his toolbox. He had bought it at an estate sale when Mina was 4. She had been reading it intermittently ever since, in the way children read things that live in proximity to their parents, not to learn them, exactly, but to understand what the parent loves. He set down the service records. He looked where she was pointing. She was right. The cap was a replacement, not original to the restoration, not documented in the 62 pages he had just read, a small but consequential substitution that someone had made at some point in the last 30 years and not written down. It was the right cap for a different variant of the 327. The difference was subtle. The effect was not. He straightened up. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something settled into place. Not triumphant, not rushed, just still. "Good eye," he said to Mina. She smiled, which was a smile that did not contain any modesty at all and was better for it. She picked up her kit. He did not fix the car that afternoon. He came back the next morning and the morning after that with parts he had sourced from two separate suppliers, one in Mississauga and one in a small operation outside Guelph that specialized in American V8 components for European-bodied cars. Both sourcing calls he made from the parking lot of the school while Mina was inside, because he had learned over the past 3 years that the hours between drop-off and pickup were the only reliable, uninterrupted hours in his life, and he had learned to use them precisely. The work itself took 11 hours across 2 days. Hargrove's team watched. They did not watch the way Bauer had watched, with the contained skepticism of a credentialed professional observing an uncredentialed one. They watched the way people watch something they are trying to learn. One of the younger technicians, a woman named Priya, who had been at the dealership for 8 months and asked more questions than anyone else on the floor, started writing things down. Darnell noticed and did not mention it. He thought it was probably the right instinct. The car started on a Wednesday afternoon at 4:18. The sound it made was the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to be exactly what it was. It was not a dramatic sound, not the roar people imagine when they picture Italian sports cars in films. It was lower and more patient than that. It settled into idle like a person settling into a chair they have sat in for 40 years. Bauer was standing 6 feet back with his hands in his pockets. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he nodded. A single, precise nod, the kind that costs something when it comes from someone who gives them rarely, and went back to his office. Priya said, under her breath, "Oh, that's beautiful." Mina, sitting cross-legged on a parts shelf with a juice box, looked up at the car with the expression she wore when something met or exceeded her expectations, which was a look of private, comfortable satisfaction, like a person whose theory has been proven correct and is not surprised. Darnell stood with his hands at his sides and listened to the engine for a while. Clifton Hargrove came down from his office at 4:40. He was a tall man, late 50s, with the careful posture of someone who understood that how he moved in a room communicated something. He looked at the car. He looked at Darnell. "What was it?" he said. Darnell told him, briefly, clearly, without embellishment. When he finished, Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "My team had it for 4 days," Hargrove said. 62 pages of service records, Darnell said. "Your team didn't have them until this morning. It makes a difference." Hargrove looked at the car again. Then he looked at Mina, who had finished her juice box and was now examining the contents of her kit with the methodical attention of someone doing inventory. "Your daughter?" he said. "She spotted the cap," Darnell said. Hargrove's expression shifted in a way that was brief and difficult to read. "How old?" "7, Darnell said. "She'll be 8 in March." Hargrove nodded. He looked at Darnell for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, the look of someone revising an assessment they had already made. Then he extended his hand. The number he named when they shook was fair. It was more than fair. It was the kind of number that communicates that the person saying it understands precisely what they are paying for, which is always, in the end, more than labor and parts. Darnell said thank you. He meant it without performance. "Mrs. Ashworth will want to know who did the work," Hargrove said. "That's up to you," Darnell said. On the way home, Mina fell asleep in the back seat somewhere between Barry and Pemberton. In the particular way, she fell asleep in cars, all at once and completely, like a switch being thrown. She still had her orange boots on. She had not let him put her kit in the trunk. It sat on the seat beside her, buckled in with the seat belt, which was something she had started doing when she was 5 and which he had stopped mentioning. He drove north on the 400 as the sun dropped behind the tree line. The clouds had come in from the west, the low gray clouds that meant real cold was coming, the first real cold of the year. He turned the heat up a little. He thought about the engine. He thought about the 62 pages of records, the way knowledge lived in documents, the way absence of knowledge lived there too, and the gaps between things written down and things merely done and then forgotten. He thought about his father-in-law who had kept records for everything, who had a filing system that Darnell had initially found excessive and now considered one of the most generous things he had ever inherited. He thought about Grace, who had laughed at the filing system too, who had learned to appreciate it, who had kept her own records in a notebook she called the log, and which Darnell still sometimes took out of the desk drawer in the office and read, not for information but for the sensation of encountering her handwriting, which had a specific forward lean that he had never been able to describe well, but which Mina was, increasingly beginning to replicate. He did not cry. He had learned, in the years since January, to locate the grief when it arrived and let it be there without it taking the wheel. It was there now, in the passenger seat, quiet and familiar, as it usually was on the drive home. In the back, Mina made a small sound in her sleep, the sound she made when she was dreaming something that required some effort on her part. He glanced at her in the mirror. She had her hand on the kit. They got home at 6:30. He carried her inside, which he could still do because she was 7, and because he had made a private decision that he would keep being able to do it for as long as it was possible. He got her boots off without waking her. He sat on the edge of her bed for a minute in the dark. Her room smelled like she did, like crayon and something faintly like outdoors, like whatever it was that accumulated in the hair of children who spent time outside and was distinct from any product or detergent, just the smell of her being in the world. He went downstairs and made himself dinner, something simple, and sat at the kitchen table and ate it. The garage was visible through the window, the small square of light he had left on over the door. He thought about the fuel line in the Civic, which still needed doing. He thought about Thursday's brake job. He thought about whether the estimate he had given Mr. Beaumont for the alternator was correct, decided it was, and made a note to call in the morning. He thought about the way Mina had said, "Dad, this thing looks different than the one in the book." Not excited, not performing. Just saying a thing she had noticed because it seemed like a thing worth saying. He washed his plate. He turned off the kitchen light. He stopped in the hallway outside her room and listened, as he did every night, to the sound of her breathing, which was the most ordinary and the most essential sound he knew. In her room, on the shelf above her bed, between a book about horses and a ceramic owl she had made at school the previous spring, was the red toolbox. She had put it there herself when she was still mostly asleep, with the careful placement of a person ensuring that something important would not be lost in the night. He had not seen her do it. He found out in the morning when she came downstairs for breakfast, and he asked her where she had put it, and she told him, as though the question was barely worth asking, where it lives. He poured her cereal. He poured her juice. He stood at the stove and made himself coffee, and listened to the particular music of a weekday morning in a house with one child and no dog, not yet. The Pemberton Concours took place 10 days later, on a Saturday that was cold and bright and had the particular clarity of an Ontario October, the kind of day where the air itself seems recently arrived from somewhere clean and northern. Darnell was not there. He had a gearbox rebuild to start, and Mina had hockey, and neither of these things moved for car shows. He heard about it later. The ISO Grifo started on the first crank. Vivian Ashworth, who turned out to be a retired civil engineer in her late 60s, who had owned the car for 22 years and restored it herself the first time before the Hamilton shop took over, apparently walked around it twice before she would allow herself to believe that the sound was what she thought it was. She had, by the account of 3 separate people who witnessed it, put one hand on the roof and stood that way for a while, not speaking. Later, a card arrived at Osei and Son. It was handwritten on heavyweight paper with a crest that Darnell didn't recognize. The writing was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who had written things by hand for most of her life. It said, "Mr. Osei, thank you for understanding what it needed." Not everyone would have known to look. He pinned it above the workbench. Below it, on a nail he had put there when Mina was 4, and which had held various things over the years. A postcard, a schedule, a drawing of a car with lopsided wheels. He hung the most recent drawing she had given him. This one was of a garage. Inside the garage, in crayon orange because that was her favorite color that week, was a car. Beside the car were 2 figures. The taller one held a wrench. The shorter one held a small red box. Above them, she had written, in the large uneven letters of a child who was still learning but learning fast. Osei and Sutini stood at the bench for a long time with his coffee going cold. Then he put on his gloves and got to work.